Okay, so this is assignment 2.2 of physiology, and it's about steady state exercise and the way our body responds to steady state exercise. So, first things first, what is steady state exercise? And steady state exercise is the point where the consumption of oxygen matches the demand of oxygen during exercise. So, in this graph, you can see that it's not immediate. It takes time to occur, and it only occurs in submaximal activity. So an example of steady state exercise could be Mo Farah running a 4,000 meter race. It's something that occurs later on during the exercise, and it isn't a quick response to occur. So during steady state exercise, you'll see that the first stage is resting, and at this point oxygen consumption is very low. However, when the exercise begins, the consumption of oxygen will increase drastically, and this is due to the demand of oxygen from the muscles in the body. And that will be a drastic increase at the start of the exercise, but the demand will eventually plateau. And that's when steady state is reached. That's when the demand of oxygen is met by that of the consumption. Heart rate will also increase whilst exercise is being performed, and this is done in correlation to that of the intensity of the exercise. So potentially the person in question, their heart rate will increase until it reaches its maximum threshold. But at some point, their heart rate will plateau due to the fact that the oxygen demand is met by the supply, so their heart will have no reason to increase its rate of beating further. And also stroke volume, which is the amount of blood beat from the left ventricle at the time, will be at its greatest during submaximal exercise, and there's no further increase when the exercise rate rises further. So next up we have Starling's law, and Starling's law is a law which implies that as venous return increases, the end diastolic volume, which is abbreviated to EDV, increases, and consequently stroke volume, which stands for which is abbreviated to SV, also increases. And stroke volume is the amount of blood which leaves the right and left ventricle in a single pump of the heart. So essentially it's the amount of blood that leaves the heart in a single beat. So Starling believes that this is based on the fact that the heart fills up with more blood, meaning there is a greater EDV filling, and the myocardium is stretched further, and subsequently there is a larger contractile force in the heart during the beat, which results in a greater amount of blood being able to be pumped out of the heart, which will cause stroke volume to increase. And when venous return is lower, so that the EDV and stroke volume and also general cardiac output are reduced as a result. So next up we've got factors that affect steady state exercise. So there are three main ones: temperature, acidity, and carbon dioxide levels. And these all affect hemoglobin's affinity to oxygen. So during exercise, hemoglobin has a lower affinity to oxygen, and this means it's more likely to disassociate oxygen to the working muscles than would be during rest. And if this occurs, then steady state is harder to achieve, and that would be because more oxygen will be used by the muscle, and therefore more would be needed to be taken into the body to regulate the demand. Alveolar ventilation is the total volume of gas that is entering the lungs per minute, and this can be calculated by using this equation, which has been abbreviated. So VE equals TV plus BR. And in full terms, that stands for the volume of air breathed per minute equals tidal volume times by breathing rate. So tidal volume is the volume of air per breath, and breathing rate is the number of breaths taken in a minute. So alveolar ventilation is more efficient for elite athletes because they take deeper breaths. This is because there is a greater tidal volume as a result of that. So the body is more likely to take in maximal oxygen, which can then reach the alveoli in fewer breaths, meaning that there's a more effective and faster gaseous exchange from the working muscles in alveoli, which means that oxygen demands will be able to be met easier. So if the breaths are deeper but less frequent, then it allows the air to reach the alveoli, and that'll be because there's more time between each breath, allowing gaseous exchange to occur without being interrupted. So this allows the oxygen to disassociate from the alveoli into the bloodstream, and it can be taken to the working muscles to disassociate the required amount of oxygen. So this can also result in a lower oxygen debt, which means a quick recovery time. So alveolar ventilation is particularly significant for steady-state exercise, such as a long-distance runner like Mo Farah, since it allows for maximum gas exchange, and subsequently meaning the body is getting the required oxygen intake. Next up, cardiac output. So throughout steady-state exercise, the cardiac dynamics will adapt and react in change of demands. So essentially that means the heart will change to what's needed of it. Cardiac output is dependent on a person's stroke volume and also their heart rate. And both of them will increase during exercise. And there's an equation for cardiac output. So cardiac output equals stroke volume times by heart rate. And we can make an estimation for athletes' cardiac output during steady-state exercise using that equation. So Mo Farah, for example, his resting heart rate had been calculated at 33 beats per minute, which is absurdly low. And his stroke volume was calculated to be around 110 milliliters. So from this we can calculate that his cardiac output is around 3.6 litres. So cardiac output is another thing that affects blood pressure, and blood pressure is determined by cardiac output and also resistance in the arteries and veins, which is a topic I'll get to later on. So blood pressure, and how it relates to venous return. So basically, during steady-state exercise, a person's cardiac output will increase, and as a result, their blood pressure will also increase. So bioreceptors, which are found in the blood vessels, they detect pressure, changes in pressure, and these will pick up the increase in blood pressure, and as a result, impulses will be sent to the CCC, or cardiovascular control center, in the medulla oblongata, and what this signal will do is decrease the sympathetic stimulus and increase the parasympathetic stimulus. So cardiac output will decrease along with the resistance. So vasodilation is the reason for this. The blood vessels vasodilate, which means they increase in girth and allow more blood to pass through them. So this causes a reduction in the degree of resistance in the blood vessels, since more blood can go through uninterrupted. Blood pressure will decrease as a result of this. So during steady-state exercise, venous return has to be equivalent to that of cardiac input. And the reason for this is that cardiac output is greater during exercise. So increased assistance is needed to make sure that venous return is also rising to match that. Now, we've got venous return plus vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So there are 5 specific mechanisms that are used to assist in the rising of venous return. So you've got skeletal muscle pumps, respiratory muscle pumps, gravity, one-way valves, and smooth muscles. So the skeletal muscles will both contract and relax, and they put greater amounts of pressure on the veins, resulting in them creating a pumping motion, which kind of squeezes and thrusts the blood back towards the heart. So that's one way that blood pressure is, one way venous return is affected. Also, the blood is then unable to flow back in the direction it came from because there are valves, and the valves will allow a certain amount of blood through, then close, preventing backflow. Same way the heart works. The muscles that are involved in breathing will contract and relax. So this results in a change in the pressure within the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavities. Hence, when you breathe in, your stomach expands, and when you breathe out, it gets shallower. So this change in pressure will consequently tighten the veins and pump the blood back to the heart. So, vasoconstriction is linked to this. The digestive system will not be needed when it comes to sporting activity. So when we're active, blood flow to this system is restricted and diverted to areas where it can be more efficiently used. And this answers a question of why we get stitches. If we eat and then exercise, the reason that we get a stitch is because our digestive system is struggling to digest the food that we've eaten due to the lack of blood flow. So, in the case of an athlete like Mo Farah, when he's performing a race, the arteries and veins in his legs and arms will vasodilate since they are working. Arteries and veins in his digestive system and torso will vasoconstrict in order for more blood to be supplied to the working muscles. Gravity is also an aid in venous return, as any blood that is above the heart and will naturally desire to flow down in the direction of the heart. So there are thin layers of smooth muscles which line the inside of veins, and these muscle fibers have the ability to contract and tighten the veins, causing the blood to flow back to the heart. And this is called venometer tone, which is used to prevent venous pooling. So finally, one-way valves prevent the possibility of any backflow throughout the veins. So as the veins tighten and the blood is forced through the valves towards the heart, the valves will close and prevent backflow from occurring. So next up we've got oxygen association and dissociation. So the respiratory system transports oxygen as it's breathed in from the air. So the air is breathed in through the nasal cavity or the oral cavity, moves through the pharynx, larynx and trachea into the lungs. It will then diffuse into the bloodstream, and this will occur when there is an imbalance of partial pressure oxygen in the alveoli. So if there's a higher partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, it's constantly restored from the atmosphere as air is inhaled. And this will be done in comparison to that of the bloodstream. So the bloodstream will become unsaturated after reaching the muscles. So this means there's a low partial pressure of oxygen. During exercise, the imbalance causes a steep concentration gradient to form and also allows diffusion of oxygen into the blood. However, during rest, the concentration is only shallow, and during exercise, the working muscles need to have the oxygen to be able to contract and create movement. So when the concentration gradient gets higher, the body must work higher to rebalance oxygen levels in the blood, and this will also result in an increased breathing rate. So the association and dissociation curve, it can go left, it can go right, and what it does is it shows the percentage of oxygen saturation of hemoglobin compared to that of the partial pressure of oxygen. So the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin means the amount of oxygen that is in the blood and attached to the hemoglobin molecules. So partial pressure means the concentration of oxygen in a gas mixture, and as you can see in the diagram, the solid black line, which goes up the graph, shows the association and dissociation during rest. So the top of the line is 100% saturation, and also 100 mmHg, which stands for millimeters of mercury, which is a measurement of blood. So at this point, the oxygen is associated from the lungs and into the bloodstream. So the blood will travel from the lungs to the capillary beds and then to the muscles to dissociate oxygen. At rest, approximately only 1/4 of oxygen is dissociated to the muscles, and due to the low partial pressure of oxygen, there is a shallow concentration gradient between the bloodstream and the muscles. Therefore, there's a very little amount of oxygen disassociating. So this is shown on the graph. At the point of 40 mmHg or 40 millimeters of mercury and 75% oxygen saturation. So if you go up there. Once the exchange of gas and dissociation of oxygen has transpired, there will be a slight decrease in the levels of oxyhemoglobin, meaning the blood is slightly unsaturated. Very slightly. So next we've got the burst shift, and during exercise the burst shift will occur, and this is when the line on the association and dissociation curve shifts toward the right. And this can be seen on the graph as the dotted line on the right hand side.